I'm Reverend Dean Nelson, chairman of the Frederick Douglass Foundation and the Douglass Leadership Institute. We are here in the great city of Annapolis, Maryland, talking today about Frederick Douglass and the idea of citizenship. Most people are unaware that Frederick Douglass was born in 1818 in Talbot County, Maryland. Many people do know that Frederick Douglass would become a great statesman and a great abolitionist, but the foundation of his ideas about America, the foundation about his ideas about citizenship were really formed early on. Douglass would, in probably around the age of 12, would have a divine encounter with God that would leave him almost speechless, wondering how in the world he would be able to live a life without the real living God. And so Douglass, at the age of 12 or 13, begins to wonder not only, where God is, but how God might use him to make a difference in the nation. Even though at the age of 13, having no idea how he would even escape from slavery, Douglass was mentored by a gentleman by the name of Hanson, whom Douglass said of Hanson that while Douglass could read and write, he had the letter, Hanson had the spirit. Hanson was one who actually would pray and prophesy over Frederick Douglass, telling him that one day he would become a great leader in America. Douglass wondering as a young boy how in the world he would become a great leader while he was still a slave. While he was young, Douglass also had the opportunity to learn how to read and write. First taught by one of his slave master's wives, Douglass was early on intrigued with the idea of being able to read and write and how that would ultimately really unleash him to become a great abolitionist and great orator. Many people are unaware of those early days in Frederick Douglass's life where he would pick up a book called the Columbia Orator, which had lists of great speeches from Europe and from America. This would be a book that would lay a firm foundation other than the Bible in Douglass's life, with a passion for liberty, a passion for freedom, and a passion for understanding of how every individual can make a contribution to his world. Frederick Douglass ultimately, by the age of 19, would escape from slavery. And during that time period, as he escaped from slavery, with the help of the woman that would become his wife, Anna Murray Douglass, Douglass would contemplate how dreadful the system of slavery was and would ultimately be used by the Lord to advance and to advocate for blacks, and ultimately, even later in his life, for the advocacy of women's suffrage. But some of those ideas Douglass learned early on, ideas of hearing from the Columbia Orator, even of some of the great founders of our nation. And while many of the founders in America had slaves, Douglass would ultimately say of the founders that they were great men. Not because they were perfect, they were flawed. But Douglass would say that they were great men because of the ideals that they embraced, and ultimately allowing the seeds of freedom to be sown in our nation that would one day allow for all men to be made free. Frederick Douglass, who was a passionate lover of freedom, got that desire, I believe, largely because of the relationship that he had with Christ. There's a fantastic scripture that says that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. And one can see in Frederick Douglass's life that passion, that desire for liberty, that desire for knowledge that would ultimately make him a great statesman and a great citizen. Frederick Douglass would escape from slavery about the age of 19 with the woman that would become his wife, Anna Murray Douglass. Once Douglass reached New Bedford, Connecticut, he would also become a licensed minister of the gospel. And he would surround himself during this time period with some of the great abolitionists of his day, like William Lloyd Garrison. As Douglass began to stand and to hang around many of these abolitionists, they would ultimately hear his testimony. And once they heard Frederick Douglass speak, they almost were convinced that he could not have been a slave. Impressed so much with his language, his use of prose, many of these abolitionists thought very quickly that they needed to get Frederick Douglass on the public scene so that they could more effectively communicate and stand against slavery. Frederick Douglass would ultimately travel around the country with Garrison, preaching and standing up for righteousness and justice. During this time period, Frederick Douglass, as an early abolitionist, would also begin to write his story. Frederick Douglass would write 3 books in his lifetime, the first of which was the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. Douglass, after writing this, would have to escape from America and go to Europe because he was afraid that he would be captured and brought back into slavery. But during this time period, Frederick Douglass would learn more about liberty. He would learn more about what it meant to be a citizen, and ultimately would advocate for the rights of all Americans to become free. Frederick Douglass, during this time period, would travel, once he came back to the United States, up and down the East Coast, making the case and arguing persuasively that those who were enslaved were equal, that they were men under the Constitution of the United States. Douglass was a master at using the founding documents of our country to call America to stand up to its founding principles. The idea that man is created equal, that we, according to the founding documents, should have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Frederick Douglass would echo the founders often as he traveled around advocating for the end of slavery and for all people to be able to have the right to call themselves Americans and to have the opportunity to be full citizens. It wouldn't come but at a price. Douglass would fight ultimately throughout the South and throughout the North with Douglass's newspaper that he would start once he moved from New Bedford, Massachusetts, ultimately leaving the abolitionist group that he was a part of, the Garrisonians, and he would go to Rochester, New York, where he would set up his new printing press and start what has been commonly remembered as the North Star. Through Douglass's paper, The North Star, he would communicate persuasively that not just white abolitionists were challenging the status quo, but a person who actually lived as a slave could overcome slavery. When Douglass began to write and publish the North Star newspaper, it gave hope to both blacks in the North and blacks in the South that one day they might have the opportunity to be free. During the course of Douglass's speaking and challenging America to stand up, he would have the opportunity ultimately to visit with President Abraham Lincoln. It's said that as Douglass waited in the waiting room for Lincoln, Lincoln would look out and see and describe, "Is that my friend Douglass?" Douglass and Lincoln would have a great relationship. Lincoln would borrow phrases from Frederick Douglass and would ultimately be convinced by the persuasion of Frederick Douglass of not just allowing ultimately men and women who were black to be free, but part of Douglass's persuasion was to allow men, black men, to fight in the Civil War. Many of you may be familiar with the story or the movie Glory that came out, I believe, in 1990. That was a fantastic story of the Massachusetts 54th Regiment that included 2 of Frederick Douglass's sons. These were black men that wanted to stand up and fight for the cause of liberty, fight for the cause of abolition, and fight for the cause of all men, including black men, to be free. A lot has been said in recent times about a famous speech that Frederick Douglass gave in the 1850s called "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." Many people have used that story of Frederick Douglass's powerful words, which were scathing against the modern slavery that America operated under. But one of the things that Frederick Douglass highlighted in that speech that many people do not give enough credit to was Frederick Douglass's respect and understanding of the Constitution of the United States. There were many, even Frederick Douglass's mentor, William Lloyd Garrison, who emphasized that the Constitution of the United States needed to be done away with, that because it was founded on principles that allowed slavery, somehow that the Constitution was no longer needed in America, needed to be ripped up and tossed away. Douglass, who early thought those ideas, came to his own conclusion about the Constitution of the United States in that famous speech, where Douglass said, if you were to search the Constitution, you will find slavery never a part of it. He said, in fact, the Constitution is a pro-freedom document and affirmed that the Constitution upon which this country was built needed to be affirmed, but it only needed to have people in America to uphold the Constitution for all people. As Douglass would continue speaking boldly around the country about the need for blacks to be freed from slavery and ultimately to be full citizens in the American process, this idea would gain ground. And as Douglass continued to advocate and ultimately would see blacks freed from the South, and ultimately would not just be free, which we saw in 1865, but ultimately with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, blacks would become full citizens in the process of America. It is most important for people to know that Frederick Douglass's commitment as an abolitionist wasn't just only to see his people free. Once black Americans had the opportunity to be free, Frederick Douglass and his commitment to full citizenship would also argue persuasively as one of the very first leaders, male leaders, to be a part of the women's suffrage movement. He would work along such leaders as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony to advance not now just for the rights of black men, but also would now advance the rights for women in women's suffrage. The women's suffrage movement credits Frederick Douglass as being one of the early pioneers who helped them ultimately to see their rights in full society as voting, just as Frederick Douglass advocated for the rights of slaves. A lot has been said about Frederick Douglass, his commitment to the abolitionist movement, his desire to see citizenship enjoyed by all Americans. But probably not enough is emphasized about Frederick Douglass and his commitment to Jesus and how that impacted everything that he did. In addition to Frederick Douglass having a great passion for liberty and wanting to see all people free, Douglass was also known for his commitment to forgiveness, his idea of redemption. Many people don't know that Frederick Douglass, upon having the opportunity to travel back to Maryland, would take the opportunity to meet with the man who once enslaved him. Douglass, looking at him, spoke to him and told him that he forgave him for what he had done. And Douglass would take one step further and prayed and blessed him because Douglass understood fundamentally that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. And a man is only really free inside when he has the ability to forgive someone who might have enslaved him. Frederick Douglass, as mentioned, was a minister of the gospel. He was a licensed AME Zion minister and preacher and would use that platform to travel around the country to speak in churches, challenging men and women to stand up to apply the biblical framework for all people. Douglass had a passion and a desire not just for faith but also for family. Frederick Douglass was known as one who was dedicated to raising his family. There are stories that are told by his daughter where they would have to memorize scripture and quote scripture at the dinner table because Douglass believed fundamentally in raising his children in the fear of the Lord. Frederick Douglass was not just one who would extend that to his children, but also to others, even to his grandchildren. There are famous pictures of Frederick Douglass at their famous house, Cedar Hill in southeast Washington, D.C., gathered with his grandchildren around them, telling them the stories of faith, telling them the stories of freedom and what he had overcome. Frederick Douglass was known before he would pass away not just as an abolitionist, not just as a great statesman, father and husband, but Douglass would also be known as somebody who was committed to seeing the people around him in his community to be elevated. Frederick Douglass will be long known as a great man of faith, a great man of conviction, a man of liberty, and I would love to remember him this way. He had this famous quote that said, where I have one great political idea. The best expression of it, he says, I have found in the Bible. It is, in substance, righteousness exalts a nation. Sin is a reproach to any people. He said, that's the whole of my politics, the positive and the negative. It's almost like Douglass was helping all of us to remember that as great as we become, we all have to answer ultimately to a great God. He knew this was true for America. He knew this was true for every individual. And in his last days of his life, he wanted people to understand that true freedom doesn't come just from people understanding a constitution or a declaration, but true freedom comes from within, and that comes from the hope in Jesus Christ. My name is Reverend Dean Nelson, and for more information about our organizations, you can visit dlinstitute.org, that's for the Douglass Leadership Institute. You can visit fdfnational.org, that's for the Frederick Douglass Foundation. And lastly, if you want to know more about Frederick Douglass, we have a website, whoisfrederickdouglass.org.